All right, we should be live. Hey, how's it going, everybody? I am actually not the host tonight. I am hosting my good friends over at the I Came with Fire podcast, Brandon and Chris. This is my third time on the I Came with Fire podcast. I think this is episode 92, right?
That's it.
So I am relinquishing the reins to my friends here. And essentially, they are going to be hosting their own podcast on my channel tonight. 24 hours from now, I will take this down and then it'll come out exclusively on their podcast. But I'm a big fan of these guys. This is the first podcast that I have featured on 3 times, actually. And I just realized that a few
That's right,
minutes
guys.
ago. So I want to give them some exposure. So, guys, take it away.
Dude, first, thank you so much for this, Luke. I appreciate that. And
Absolutely.
it's pretty awesome to have you back for the third time to talk to us, especially now. The last two conversations, we talked a lot about Egypt, but always from like a perspective where you hadn't been and had the opportunity to be there. And we talked a lot about your, adventures in the Peten and, some of this excavation and anthropology you were doing in the jungle there. But I'm really excited to hear about you going to Egypt finally. And I think you may remember us talking to you about how this was like my first love of history. Like I think I've said this to you before that growing up, I always was like really infatuated with Indiana Jones, right? And like learning about like what you do, right? You're not an archaeologist or an anthropologist, but like you're as freaking close to it as anybody I've ever met. And so, like I was texting you earlier, I said you're my spirit animal. I mean that wholeheartedly. But for everybody who's watching this right now who has not seen us, I am Brandon. I'm the host, founder, producer of I Came with Fire podcast. I was in the Air Force for almost 15 years. I was a security forces member. I said security, not special forces, which is just the Air Force's retarded way of saying military police because we have to be different, apparently, even though we are the Army's little retarded brother, right, Chris? But yeah, now I do cybersecurity and other fun things, and I'm out here in the great state of California. So, but Chris, man.
Yeah, what is up, guys? My name is Chris. I'm a Green Beret medic, a husband, and a father, and I'm actually the most consistent guest. So I got you beat out just a little bit there, Luke. I'm the most consistent guest on I Came with Fire
It's true,
podcast.
actually.
And legally, I have to say this right off the top. Anything that we say tonight are completely and totally our own opinions, and they do not represent the Department of Defense, any organization within the United States Armed Services, or any other entity entirely. They are completely and totally the opinions of us.
That's it. Yeah.
Listener discretion is advised.
Chris may or may not have gotten in trouble a little bit. May or may not. We won't go into it. It's okay. If you want to find out the full story, you can head on over to our page and find out why Chris got smacked a little bit. But anyway, Luke, thank you again for coming back on and talking with us. I'm really excited to hear about Egypt. I think it's a lot of most people's first exposure to ancient history, I think, is either Egypt or ancient Rome. And so a lot of people have a big interest in it, but not everybody knows it as well as you do now. That's for certain. So I would be really interested just to start with hearing about your trip there and, why you went, but more importantly, like what you saw and your impressions of it. And if you want to start from the beginning, or we can jump around wherever you feel is the most important. But I'm really excited to hear this, brother.
Yeah, man. So I mean, gosh, just like you, my first exposure to the ancient world was Egypt. One of the first memories that I have that I can remember that stands out in my mind was my grandpa on his nightstand. He always had this book called Western Progression. And speaking of which, I wonder if I. Oh wow, I've never shown this before. All right.
Oh, awesome.
Premiering now.
All right. Right.
So my grandfather that died earlier last year, I've talked about him so many times. And, he's really the precipice and the inspiration for my love for the ancient world. He was a pastor and a missionary, but he was very interested in the biblical world and the lives of those people. Something about that resonated with me as well. I remember when I was a kid, he would be up at the pulpit preaching, but I'd have the illustrative Bibles that show the palm trees of the Tigris and Euphrates River, of the Nile River.
I had one
of Moses being, sent down the Nile, and
right.
and the princesses hiding in the reeds and everything. I would just stare at those every Sunday. And, I never really cared about most of the sermons. I think it just didn't connect with me as a kid. But when you get a glimpse into the biblical world, that, something about that struck me. And what I remember was looking at this book called Early Progress, West and West. And this would be sitting on my grandpa's nightstand. And I think he would just kind of read through it a little bit. Those are some of his underlines. He would just kind of
That's
read through the
awesome.
book a little bit every day. And I never actually, obviously, I didn't pick up this book as I was a kid and read it. It was, beyond me. But I remember looking at this pharaoh right here that was on the
Mm-hmm.
side. And that's probably one of the images that is most heavily imprinted in my mind when I think about my childhood. And it made some kind of inevitable impression on me. Like it essentially solidified that one day I would go there. And, so I traveled to Egypt after I'd just been in Peru. And you guys heard my story well, when I went to Peru, I was standing down and I promise this will
Oh, you're
circle
good.
back to Egypt. But when I went to Peru, I was standing at that megalithic stone granite gate, and I was looking at this picturesque view of the city, just like you see in all the postcards and all the posters. There's a huge gate right here. The city is just crawling down the mountain and then up the mountain up to Huayna Picchu, and I was just like, blown away. Absolutely perfect day to see Machu Picchu for the first time. So I pull up my phone to take a photo of it, and I look at my phone, and the Apple Mail app is open, and I have 4,000 emails that I've never read on my Apple Mail app. I'm never going
Right.
to read them. I'm never going to email anybody from Apple Mail. And what was interesting was I was typing an email. The email was already selected, and the little thing was blinking as though I was ready to type an email. And it was to my grandfather's email. It said, Richard Mooney 42 at gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never sent him an email before. I don't even know how I actually had his email in my iCloud. And I just sat there looking at it, and something just like rushed over me, and I had to compose myself really quickly. And it was like probably the most overwhelming moment of assurance that there was something beyond this world for me. I tell people all the time that I am a Christian, and but something about that experience right there was like this overwhelming reassurance that there was something greater out there. I call it like a poke from the next world. My mom calls it a God
Yeah.
wink. But I kind of just, put my phone in the back of my pocket and just composed myself, and then, just held on to that. Well, I go to Egypt, and after a 28-hour travel day, I get to my hotel, and I'm looking up at the horizon, trying to scan the horizon for the pyramids, and I can't see them. I can't see them. And then, the whole horizon was these two huge black triangles. And
Wow.
something about the immensity of that, I don't know, it touched something in me that I wouldn't have been able to reach myself. And it just came out, man. Like I had just, it was all the emotion of traveling so
Mm-hmm.
much, seeing so many of the things I'd wanted to see. And I think doing it, really getting into it just after my grandpa had passed, and I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't share any of it with him. I just think there was some kind of sadness and fulfillment that came out of me, as though it was, this was something that I was destined to do.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't just travel to Egypt as a tourist. My life and the choices that I had made and the path I had risked a lot to go down led me to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like The Alchemist.
Yes. Great book.
He's traveling to Egypt to try to find himself. He wants to see the
Mm-hmm.
pyramids, and you know, I had a profound moment like that.
Yeah.
And so I just felt like going to Egypt. Um, I've had people ask me like, "Why did you go? What was it that you were going there to see?" And to be honest with you, I knew going in that I was going to be back so many other times, and so it was almost like I was going and I was just letting go and letting my life pull me there, and just to see it for the first time, um, with my eyes, completely open. So, anyways, I think an actual answer to what you're saying is I wanted to go to get a feel for Egypt, to get
Hmm.
the context of the archaeological sites. You hear so many people talk about the pyramids. Anyone who hasn't been to Egypt, you have this very liquid idea of what you think Egypt might be like, of how big you think the pyramids
Exactly.
might be. But you really don't understand everything that's on the Giza Plateau. It's impossible. You really don't understand how far away these sites are from each other. You really don't understand how many of the sites there are. And I just knew that I needed to see the context in real life. I'd been so many
Hmm.
other places. I'd been to so many other ancient sites. I've been to, uh, I studied the Maya towards the end of college and right after college, and then visited almost all of the Maya world. I think there's like 3 or 4 more major archaeological sites that I need to see out of 35 of them. And
Hmm.
after visiting those so much, having previously studied them before I ever went, it was just overwhelmingly obvious every time how necessary it is to visit these sites, to actually be able to speak about them.
Hmm.
So, you know, I had sort of put Egypt on the back burner because it felt inaccessible. Mexico is an easy flight. I'm in Texas. Texas breeds Mesoamerican archaeologists.
Yeah.
You just hop over to Mexico. It's like that.
Proximity. Yeah.
Yeah, Egypt is it was not as accessible, and I was scared to go by myself. Kind of needed some connections, and eventually, as my career progressed and I made those connections, it was just it worked out to
Yeah.
go. So I've been to Egypt twice in the last 3 months, and I guess maybe 7 weeks I spent there in total, and
Wow.
I
Almost 2 months.
feel like now I have a pretty good grasp on Egypt. The first time I went, I think I doubled my understanding of Egypt, and the second time I went, I feel like I doubled it again. There's just so many
That's
things that
incredible.
so many things that I I don't know. Egypt is so multifaceted and so layered. I mean,
Hmm.
you could study you could study the pyramids your entire life and not understand it all.
That's
But
incredible.
as a generalist like myself, you know, I have kind of let my own interest guide my study. And so you end up getting this really sporadic understanding of ancient Egypt because, my degree was just general anthropology. So largely I'm self-taught. I think anthropology
Hmm.
you kind of learn the ethics of anthropology, and you sort of learn, an anthropological approach to things, but, eh, you know,
Sure.
maybe if I went and got my PhD, it'd be different, but I probably also wouldn't have ever developed the communication skills, so you trade one for the other. Um, but Egypt is so multifaceted. I could spend, have you guys ever watched the channel History for Granite?
I don't think I have. No.
He's all about the pyramids. That guy could probably do a PhD level study on the pyramids. But I wonder if I spoke to him about the 18th dynasty, which is
Mm.
around the time of the Exodus pharaoh. How much would he know?
Yeah.
Right? There's just so much to know, and I
We're
feel
talking
like,
about thousands of years. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, uh, something that I'm particularly interested in is the epilogue of Egypt. Most people don't realize this. So you have this prologue, which is everything that happens before 3100 BC. That's the unification of Egypt. That's when Narmer comes in. He's the first
Hmm.
pharaoh that unites Upper and Lower Egypt and makes it a kingdom. But the thing is, he had to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. So there were already two
Hmm.
civilizations living in Egypt. Whoa, what's all that history that's there? So you have this
Right.
prologue of Egypt that goes on for I don't know, let's call it from 4000 BC to 3100 BC. So you have an extension of 900 years, almost 1,000 years. Really, it goes beyond that. But then you have from 3100 BC, you have from there all the way through the Old Kingdom, which is 1,000 years later, 2100 BC, through the Middle Kingdom down to about 1500 BC. Then you have the New Kingdom from 1500 to 1,000. And then you have these different periods where Egypt is occupied from 1000 BC all the way to Alexander conquering in 332 or 331. And then you have 300 years of Ptolemaic rule until Cleopatra. Mm-hmm. Now, people think that Cleopatra's death is the end of Egypt. It's not. Egypt has pharaohs for another 3 centuries. They have 300 years of pharaohs after that, but they're all Roman emperors, right?
Right. It's like a vassal state of Rome at that point.
And it kind of, I say 3 more centuries, but really it's like 670 years left of ancient Egypt, when it's under Roman occupation. But Constantine shuts all the temples down, and so whatever. But you have so much history there, and I think that having been twice, now I have this much greater picture of how vast ancient Egypt is and how the history of it is just so large. It towers over every other civilization.
It's so crazy what you just said about how after Cleopatra, there were several hundred or 300 more years of pharaohs, because that era of Cleopatra is Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, right, Octavian after that. And then you consider you have these pharaohs existing for another couple hundred years, and it really was only like if you're talking about the year 300 AD, 100 years later was when the Visigoths sacked Rome, I think at 412, right? So you have the mighty Roman Empire only 100 years after that, the first time it's like actually sacked, so it's kind of crazy to think that there's thousands of years prior to that where the Egyptian civilization was flourishing. And to your point too earlier about like really understanding like how big the Egyptian empire was and those civilizations and the nuances there, I can relate to that because when you go to Europe, right, and you think of Rome, like one of the first things that may come to your mind, obviously, is just the city of Rome and Italy. But having been to, Germany, France, Belgium, the UK, right, and you go and there's Roman ruins in each of these countries, right, and you're just like, wow, like this is Rome. Even here in Germany, you wouldn't think about it, right? Like you go to Germany, you go to, the Porta Nigra there in Trier, you see that was a Roman fort, right? You can go to the UK and you can go visit the Roman baths, right? And it's just it's incredible to, that's contextualize just how vast the Roman Empire was for me in that way. So I understand what you're saying. It's pretty incredible to think about too, how they were split, like you said, upper and lower Egypt, like upper and lower Nile. But you have to when you think about it that way and you try to view those people and understand, like put yourself in those shoes, like each of these kingdoms had to have like their own customs, their own mannerisms, their own ways of doing things. And like, about one another. And there's these like there had to just be these significant differences in what they did, for Narmer to want to go up to Lower Egypt, and like you said on Julian Dory's podcast, to smite the pharaoh of Lower Egypt, right? Like what brought that on, right? These cultural differences in people that eventually would become one kingdom of Egypt is pretty interesting.
Another thing that's interesting is that is interpreted as actually the second unification of Egypt. There's evidence for a first and initial unification, but it fell apart during pre-dynastic times. I don't know much about that time period, but it just alludes to kind of what you were saying, that there's this primordial era. Imagine it's 400 to 900 years of history. I mean, it's probably more, but 400 to 900 years of significant history of these two lands living in the same river, butting heads against each other until eventually a very powerful man conquers both. It just, something about that fascinates me. And so going back to being a generalist, it is hard for me to want to settle down anywhere. I love the history for Granite Channel, but I couldn't just do pyramids all the time.
Yeah.
I am equally as fascinated. I've told people this before. When I used to be more into the uh, Atlantis myth and looking for evidence of Atlantis and everything, I would also be enthusiastic about talking about the actual like biblical dynastic Egyptians, and people less interested in that. They want to know more about Atlantis. And I would say, well, to be honest, I'm interested in all of it. I love dynastic Egypt, biblical Egypt, as much as I love, looking for hints and clues for this ancient lost civilization. I've always loved all of it. And it's expanded so much to the point that, right now I'm obsessed with the Etruscans, pre-Roman Italian civilization. Yeah. Amazing. I just don't necessarily have any kind of preference. And so it was just so important for me to spend all that time in Egypt to try to build this solid, well-rounded foundation, this understanding of this 3,100 plus years. That was really my only purpose in going. That the next time I go, I'm going to focus more on a few things. We can dive into them, but I want to focus more on really spending some time thinking about different aspects of the pyramids. I want to also spend some time looking into the 19th and 18th dynasty, Amenhotep II, who is probably the Exodus pharaoh, who I believe he's the Exodus pharaoh. And then I also want to look into the 19th dynasty, Merenptah, and the pharaoh that comes after him, fending off the sea people, this mysterious people that showed up in Egypt and crushed, they were crushing everybody around, the Bronze Age Mediterranean. But
coincide with the collapse of the Bronze Age. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so those are a couple of my interests, and then the last one is I'm always interested in the lotus flower. Like that's my little baby pet project right now, and we could dive into that as well. So in the future, pyramids, sea people, and the Exodus, and the lotus flower. Those are my things that I'm sinking into in the future.
So I would love to hear more about the lotus flower because I have an interest in like this as well. Have you ever checked out Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key?
Yes. Yeah.
I love that book. And obviously it's about psychedelics. Do you have it?
I have it somewhere. I'm not exactly sure.
Me too. Chris has seen the library that's in here that everybody can't see on
Accio book.
Yeah, exactly. It's in here somewhere, but no, his work is really crazy when you read about it. And you can understand why a lot of people find it to be hard to digest, but I think it's pretty incredible. And, but that's something that I would love to hear your thoughts on. And, some of the mysticism moments that you talked about, like you, had said before about like talking about Joseph being a dreamer, right? And like the significance of dreams in ancient Egypt. And it sounded like, and I'll be real, like I didn't listen to the whole podcast you did with Julian.
Well,
I know. Yeah, no, that's incredible. And I plan on listening to it because he always does good interviews. And
I got through 2/3 of it today. It's a chunker for sure. You guys went deep.
But I would love to hear about your ideas with the lotus flower and how that splices into a lot of this like Egyptian mysticism, I guess I would say, if that's accurate to use that word.
Yeah. So, so being fully transparent, this is still like in its infancy. My, the paper that I'm writing on it that'll turn into a video is still just ideas vomited onto the screen. The beginning of it happened. So it started actually when I listened to Brian Murarescu's podcast with Joe. I got the book, The Immortality Key, which, to be honest, I think I've lost it. I don't know where it is.
It's in Egypt.
It might be. So I got his book, The Immortality Key, and I found it a lot to digest. It was just very different than, I'm a pure like historian archaeology guy. I don't care really much for mythology, even though, I mean, that's not mythology. I don't care so much. I guess it has a little bit to do with it, but I don't care so much for mythology or the esoterics of ancient history.
Hmm.
Although I know that those aspects are very important. It's just that it's just history and anthropology that interests me, because I like to
Hmm.
get into those people's worlds and try to understand, what's going on in their mind at this time. What is this ancient person's perspective of X, Y, and Z? So I I started really thinking about, there was all this ancient vase, this Egyptian vase hype. I'm sure you guys are aware of this. These people call them precision vases, but these
Hmm.
really masterfully carved hard stone vases that come from the late pre-dynastic, early dynastic periods of Egypt. Maybe they don't
Hmm.
even come from dynastic Egypt at all. It might all be pre-dynastic. I started thinking about, what are some actual uses for these vases? Why do they why would they go to these lengths, especially in pre-dynastic Egypt, to do something like this?
Hmm.
We don't have evidence of the lathe, but the lathe couldn't even really make these because they had the little stone handles.
Hmm.
I just started thinking about, what are some realistic ideas. I've seen people propose that they're parts of machines or something, and I just, I kind of, whatever. Um, so I started thinking, well, something valuable had to go in these, but I don't really know what that would be. Is perfume enough? I mean, I know that perfume is a big thing in Egypt. Is perfume enough? Or oils? Is that valuable enough to put it in there?
Thinking practically, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. 5,000 years ago or more, maybe oil is the most valuable thing that you can have. I was trying to come up with some idea. So somewhere along the way, I got interested in cultures around Egypt, on the peripherals of Egypt. That's kind of how, I guess that's how it is for every historian.
Hmm.
Things start to branch off, and so um, I started looking into the Bronze Age cultures, because at the time when Egypt builds the pyramids, Egypt is way up here and everyone else is way down here. Nobody is competing with Egypt during the Old Kingdom. It's not until the Bronze Age that all the peripheral cultures start to rise up and their economy becomes able to compete with Egypt. The Nile is just so rich, right? It's just so rich, and it just, it's not because of the Egyptians necessarily. It's because of the Nile that
Hmm.
ancient Egypt existed. It was the gift. The Nile gifted the Egyptians everything that they had,
The silt,
as
right?
as Herodotus said. Yeah, yeah. The
Mm-hmm.
black land, this fertile, rich topsoil that is constantly that constantly fertilizes the riverbanks when
Hmm.
Egypt is inundated. So I started looking into Minoan culture, Minoan
Hmm.
Crete, if you guys are familiar with this.
Hmm.
And something I found there when I was looking at other cultures' stone vases, I had heard before that you can find some of these Egyptian style stone vases in the museum at Athens, and
Hmm.
I thought, man, that's really interesting. So I started looking into that, and the idea was just that these were Athenian traders who were coming into Egypt and they're buying expensive materials and going back. But I found another thing. I've never spoken about this publicly before right now.
Here we go.
On Minoan Crete, there are vases that were crafted in the early Bronze Age by Minoan sailors who were visiting Egypt, and they were being exposed to these pre-dynastic vases. They were bringing some of them home, and then in their own materials on Crete, so like serpentine, a little bit, softer
Hmm.
stones, but we know that they come from Crete. They were trying to remake these vases.
Hmm.
But something that's unique about them is that the Greeks are So just in general, the Egyptians are very subtle people. They're minimalistic. They're like Apple technology of the ancient world, right? Super sleek, super
I dig it.
minimalistic. Less is more. To the Greeks and all the various Greek cultures, more was always more. They're not very
Yeah.
subtle people. You look at
Very,
Egyptian,
very decadent.
yeah, you look at Egyptian vases, and sometimes they're not even, the really nice stone ones aren't even painted. It's just
Hmm.
they let the stone and the polish of the stone speak for itself. But the Greeks, they like to paint naked people and flowers and grapes and olives all over the vases. They're very extravagant.
Think about
So
Knossos, the palace there.
exactly. So the Minoans put their own spin on these pre-dynastic vases that they're trying to make. Um, and they put plants on them. They put flowers
Mm.
on the plants. And on one of these Egyptian style Minoan vases, they paint the lotus flower spilling out of the top of it. And this is seen on multiple of these specimens of vases. And it got me thinking, all around the Greek world, the vessels that that the Greeks use for certain practices, they will depict the exact flour or extract or wine or
Hmm.
whatever it is that's going in that vessel. They will also depict it on the vessel. And it just got me thinking, lotus flower. That's really
Hmm.
interesting. There's no lotus flower that grows naturally on Minoan Crete, as far as I'm aware. That
Mm.
lotus flower is exclusive to the Nile, Asia, and Mexico. The
Oh
Maya
wow.
the Maya had the blue
Hmm.
lotus as well, but that blue lotus comes from Egypt. Another interesting side note is, if you look at the artifact recovery data, about 3100 BC, these hardstone vases aren't being made anymore.
Mhm.
The Egyptians aren't making them for whatever reason. I've seen a couple reasons posited, like because the because dynastic Egypt began and the kingdoms were united, there was a direct shift in offerings. Who knows? It's just
Okay.
archaeologists trying to speculate on what they think. But anyways, around 3100 BC, as far as we can tell from the data, these stone vases aren't being made anymore, but they
Mm.
still exist. There's tens of thousands of them. Let's say in total there's 100,000 of them that exist in Egypt. Well, 10,000 to 40,000 of them get buried under Djoser's step pyramid. I'm sure you guys have seen this huge cache of these hardstone vases that were found in there. Most of them are smashed to bits, but some were recovered, in basically full form.
Yeah.
They also find these hardstone vases just in various tombs throughout the Old Kingdom. So from 31 early dynastic through the Old Kingdom. So from 3100 BC to 2100 BC. Beginning in 3100 BC, there are a lot of them being buried in tombs with people. These are heirlooms being passed down throughout the Old Kingdom. But by 2100 BC, at the end of the Old Kingdom, that's it. Once the first intermediate period begins and we get to the Middle Kingdom, getting to 1900 BC, now 1200 years after the vases are not being made anymore, we see no more of these vases being found in graves. So if you
Weird.
follow along, that means that they're all buried. They're all being
Mm.
buried under the ground. There shouldn't be any more of them around. But as far as the data tells us that the Minoans arrive in Egypt sometime between 1800 and 1500 BC. But they're seeing these vases because they're going back home and trying to recreate them. So they still exist
Hmm.
somewhere. Just a little interesting side note that I think is interesting. We don't find them in tombs for the
No, that
last
is really
for
cool.
the last 400 or 500 years. But when the Minoans arrive, the Minoans encounter them and take them back home and then try to recreate them. So I started going down the rabbit hole of okay, maybe the Greeks are telling us what's being used in these vases and in these vessels. Well, the trail kind of ends there in Greece. All I can posit is that the Greeks are not as subtle as the Egyptians, and they are telling you what this vase is for by unsubtly depicting what's on there. So I go
We
back.
still do that.
So exactly. So I go back to Egypt and I start researching the lotus flower. Well, not surprisingly, um, there's a lot of debate as to what exactly the lotus flower, what its function was, what the Egyptian perception of the lotus flower was. Going through them, I guess let's start with the most out there thing is that it was like a sex drive enhancer, that it was
Okay.
a libido medicine. There are some
Okay.
botanists who studied it in the 90s, and they saw that the chemical makeup of it, that the properties could, increase your sex drive, like an ancient Viagra. Well,
Yeah.
maybe that was happening. Um, they they do this by showing these researchers, I guess this is 30 some odd years ago, they do this by showing some of these Egyptian papyri scrolls. They roll them out, and it's these porn scrolls, and it's showing all these different positions, and in all these positions, everyone is smelling the lotus flower. They've got the lotus flower hanging over their head. They're holding the lotus flower up to somebody else. Some people have the lotus flower, down by their crotch, and so they're kind of just positing, well, maybe this here is very subtly telling us something.
Seems pretty direct to me, honestly.
I was hoping you were going to tell me that all the researchers lined up and they tried some, like all Super Trooper style.
Yeah.
We got to figure out what this is. Let's take some.
No, well, you see, the hard thing is that I think in the 90s, there were a couple of these specimens of the lotus flower that still existed, but the ancient lotus flower of the Nile does not exist anymore. Every single flower was picked in ancient times. I think that there may have been a couple of specimens that survived up to 30 years ago that were in these greenhouses, but
like in captivity.
Yeah, but I don't even think that they were exactly the same. I think that they tested the genetics of those, and they were slightly different than these mummified, preserved lotus flowers that they had found, and they can extract the DNA of the flower and test it. But there was only.
So what you're saying is the flower that's being depicted on these incredibly unique vessels, that like the vessels disappeared out of the archaeological record at some point, and then the flower that's being depicted on them also has disappeared, and so we know they're linked, but that's where the trail kind of ends on both those. Is that what you're saying?
So there's a lot more to say about the lotus flower. I guess I just meant in the Greeks potentially giving us a clue. I wish that there was even more, but all it is them depicting the lotus flower on these pre-dynastic style vases that they made in Crete using serpentine stone from Crete. Does that make sense? So we know that it was them making it because they made it in their own stone type in Crete. That kind of serpentine stone isn't found in Egypt. So that it's not, we know it's not something that they brought from Egypt to Crete. So they're doing this in the Bronze Age, which is like this other mystery of, okay, so these vases are still around, even though we're not seeing them being buried with people anymore. That's kind of interesting, what's happening there.
It is.
Probably what it is they're just so valuable that people are preserving them through one way or another. I mean, people, even I'm sure in ancient times, people marveled over these things. They knew that they were important. So I start looking into the Blue Lotus, and again, I end up finding out that kind of out there speculation that they could have, been performance enhancement drugs. Well,
I like that.
I also see some researchers speculating that they could have been smoked, that you could have rolled it up and you could have smoked it like marijuana, and it would have had some kind of mild psychoactive effect. And if you did it in large quantities or a high concentration, it could be very potent. Maybe similar to smoking weed, but not exactly the same effect. More so just like a chilled out effect. That's what they posit. Now, why no Egyptologist, as far as I know, has published a study of them just getting super high, smoking rolled up Blue Lotus, even though it's slightly different DNA than the ancient Blue Lotus. I don't know. That seems like some needed archaeological work to me.
Right. I need you guys to take one for the team. Let's figure this out.
I know, right? It's I was talking. Keep going.
I was just going to say, it almost sounds like trying to preserve this like facade image of ancient Egypt, and that somehow if they did drugs, then it would corrupt this image of what they were. Like, I don't know. That's kind of where that sounds to me.
Yeah. I see a lot of knee jerk hesitance to attribute anything to psychedelics with a lot of different cultures. But especially Egypt. I've asked many Egyptologists, just kind of off the cuff, especially while I'm in Egypt. You travel with a lot of native Egyptian Egyptologists, and I'll ask them, do you think that they're taking any kind of substance in the temples to help them reach Amun or whichever god of your choice? And almost always the knee jerk reaction, and I don't know how much evidence is based off of in their mind. There's this knee-jerk reaction to say no, but then I can get into like the logistics of nitpicking that. And I'm like, okay, so did they really believe in the gods then? If they did, are we to believe that they're somehow more able to connect to this outer world than we are today? I mean, is that really what's going on? Or if that's not happening, do the priests just not actually believe in any of the gods, and it's all a scam to the Egyptian people? It's a scam to get, hey, if you want your grandpa to survive in the next world, you need to be consistently bringing him your finest fruit and meat and barley to this temple, and leave it right here. Leave this offering for the gods. And then, when all the people leave, the priests eat it. You start insinuating that, and then Egyptologists, they're kind of like, nobody wants to say that either. So, and I'm not like bashing on Egyptologists. Like I would be an amateur Egyptologist as well. But I'm just saying there are these hard questions that we kind of dance around with every ancient culture.
Sure.
And for some reason, there's this need to, I don't know, there's like these weird made up lines that some
control. Would you say control the narrative? Because something that I've noticed in just and you guys are way more adept in this subject than me. I'm like History Channel level when it comes to Egyptology and what I remember.
We got to work.
That's a funny way to say that.
From reading in the scripture. Well, I don't want to misrepresent myself either. But one thing that I have noticed is that whenever non-Egyptian Egyptologists travel over to Egypt to study over there, it just seems to me like the Department of Antiquities in Egypt has a very close hold on who can go where, who can study what, and all of the antiquities are kept very close hold on. And it just comes off to me as like, is this just like an attempt to control the narrative around what people are allowed to see? Is it for reasons of, Egypt is so famous for its antiquities and its archaeology that it's like, we need to keep this, I don't want to say facade, but this veneer up, right, of like how important Egypt is to the ancient world. I know that there's been theories batted around in recent times about kind of the shifting of the understanding of how central Egypt was, as far as the ancient world is concerned. And I've been wondering, is it an attempt to kind of control that and make sure that they stay central to the narrative? I don't know, but it's just something that I've noticed from what little study that I've done.
Yeah. I don't think. Keep on.
No, go ahead, Luke. I was just going to say, one of the conversations we had on another episode, we asked you about Zawi Hawass, because we talked a little bit about Egyptology. I know there was like kind of a subject you didn't want to get into too much. And I've heard other people say that on like other podcasts too. And I'm not asking you to, but like the implication when I've heard other people talk about him is he's very protective of the history that they're okay with people knowing, I guess, right? And when I say history that they're okay with, it does almost imply a narrative, but like it is it gets harder to control what you want people to think, and then to consider as well, like how much the British took apart like Egypt's history. Like people were eating mummies and taking artifacts and all these things, right? So there's this like, for him, who obviously very much loves his country and the history, I feel like he probably has this mantle of needing to protect it. And so things like that don't maybe necessarily have an answer. It's not conspiratorial, but there's not enough like fact there to like make a conclusion, that it's like, I want to stay away from these things and stick more to the things that I can speak on, because it's the most solid way to talk about my culture and my history without going into things that too many people can speculate on and draw conclusions that aren't necessarily founded. Does that make sense? Like kind of how like I interpret that.
Yeah, I spent a lot of the last like 3 or 4 years um, kind of dancing around things and trying to like be nice, give people the benefit of the doubt. Um, you know, in doing all of that, all I ever got was whacked over the head by like the same people that I have been giving the benefit of the doubt and purposely not like going out of my way to badmouth them. I'll end
Yeah.
up on Julian Dory's podcast, and we have this huge segment where I try to explain for the average Joe that's, driving to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, that's, doesn't, know
Listen,
Egyptology from Adam, but he's, like, are the pyramids really tombs? And I try to explain to a guy like that the reason why that's always been the most likely thing. Sure, you can entertain
mm-hmm.
other things, but like this is the base. Like this is why. Every time that I have heard an Egyptologist on a popular platform try to explain, get asked, are the pyramids really tombs? What do you think about this thing? They always have this condescending scoff, right? And then this explanation is just piss
Yeah.
poor. They give this piss poor explanation as to why, they give this piss poor explanation of the tomb theory. And I was just always just disappointed in that. No normal person is buying into this condescending attitude, this kind of like
Right.
scoff, ivory tower attitude, and then this awful explanation. That always frustrated me. Egyptologists as a whole don't frustrate me. It's particular instances. I think the vast majority of Egyptologists are just normal people that are obsessed with Egypt and get paid nothing to study Egypt their whole life. That said, Zahi Hawass, frustratingly dishonest person.
Right. Right.
When you go to the where was it that we went to? Was it I think it was Abydos. It may have been
Okay.
Abydos that we went to, and they make you watch this little documentary before you're able to go into the site. They do this at some places. They used to do it at the Unfinished Obelisk, but they don't do it anymore.
Little propaganda.
Yeah, at the Unfinished Obelisk, they used to show this documentary. They stopped before I ever went to Egypt, where
Mm-hmm.
they would show you how the obelisk was made using those dolerite pounding stones, and you would basically drop this really hard stone on granite, which is slightly softer than the dolerite. And
Mm-hmm.
supposedly the idea is that they release or free this huge, roughly shaped obelisk from the ground by dropping these stones and just microscopically, grain by grain, freeing that obelisk from the ground. They used to show that. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people that cast doubt on whether that's the full, means by which these obelisks were freed.
Sure.
I certainly cast a little bit of doubt on it. I'm not saying they're not using the dolerite pounding stones, because the freaking stones are everywhere.
Yeah.
Anyways, so we go to I think it's Abydos that we're at, and at the Temple of Seti. And they show this documentary where in part of the documentary, they talk about how there was this mummy that used to be on display at this weird museum in Canada. There was
Mm-hmm.
an Egyptian mummy on display there. Eventually, the Ministry of Antiquities in Egypt got to look at that mummy, and examined it and they realized this has compelling facial features to the family of the 19th dynasty, like the Setis, like Ramses the Great. This
Oh
guy
wow.
looks like Ramses the Great. So they end up doing more research on him and sort of conclude that this is actually Ramses the First. That this mummy that was on display at this weird little museum in Canada. So, anyways, the Canadians sell the mummy back to Egypt, and it's an interesting story. Then Zahi Hawass comes in at the end, and he goes, I am the one that I am the one that analyzed this mummy. I am the one that determined that this is Ramses the one, or Ramses the First. I made this discovery. And, everybody on our group is like rolling their eyes that it's just ridiculous. Like, you don't even give credit to any of the people who are on the team that did all of that hard work. It's about you,
Right.
And that probably went up on TV in the 2000s, right? So Zahi's still around.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know. That's not a good look, right? That's your face of Egyptology.
Egyptology.
You go a lot of places. You go a lot of places in Egypt, and even the local Egyptians are a little bit annoyed with him. So about controlling the narrative, that is, I'm not really like critiquing you, but that is that phrase is used a lot in like the pseudo archaeology realm or whatever, which I guess I used to identify more with. Now I don't care. I tried to appease academics by whatever, and they bashed me over the head, and then the pseudo archaeology crowd bashes me over the head. Now I just don't.
Well, you're a sellout now, right?
Because now I just don't care. Like, I'm just doing me, and like when people listen to me talk, I swear to Amun that I am telling you the truth as I see it. I'm not lying to you. If I was a grifter, like so many other people out there, I'd have a lot more money. I can just tell you that right now.
If you were a grifter, you'd be swearing to Aten, right? That's what you'd be doing.
I'd be swearing to the Aten.
That's right.
That's an interesting thing. We can do a whole podcast.
I got that reference.
Yeah.
How about that? We could do a whole podcast on the Amarna period, right? Like, isn't that what it's called?
Yeah. That's deep lore. If you understand that. So anyways, controlling the narrative. That phrase, even though I get what you're saying, that phrase is usually applied to, is the Egyptian government trying to hide the truth about the fact that there was this ancient, lost, past, advanced human Atlantean civilization that built the pyramids.
Not necessarily where I was going, but I see what.
I totally get what you're saying. So that's what I was saying. I wouldn't use that exact terminology.
Gotcha.
As far as just side note addressing the ancient lost civilization, when I listen to Plato's Atlantis, this idea of a civilization having existed 12,000 years ago, to whatever capacity it may have actually existed, that doesn't strike me as like, oh no, that definitely didn't happen. But there's nothing to me that indicates that it happened in Egypt. 12,000 years ago, you don't need to live along the Nile. You can live near Mega Lake Chad. You can live in all the vastness of North Africa that is totally ripe for the picking. That's the place that you would live. People lived along the Nile because they had to. All of North Africa dries up, and you either have to go south to kind of where the Congo and the savannah is, to where it's much more green, or you've got to be jam-packed, shoulder to shoulder, living along the Nile. And ancient Egypt was destined to either be a catastrophic failure or a massive success, because just like New York City, you only have a limited amount of space. So it's either going to become the greatest city that the world has ever seen, or it's going to be nothing, And so New York City became, the creme de la creme of all cities that have ever existed.
Yeah.
Egypt is exactly the same way. It worked. Anyway, so that's my perspective. Controlling the narrative. Yes, the Ministry of Antiquities wants to have an absolute vice grip on everything that happens in Egypt. How morally wrong is that? Well,
it's a good question.
Think about it. this is another thing, another bit of perspective I gained in traveling to Egypt so much. As I say so much, but recently, spending so much
A hell of a
time
lot
there,
more than me.
spending so much time there, I met a lot of Egyptians there and realized that a hell of a lot of Americans make a lot of money on ancient Egypt, bringing tours in, making documentaries, YouTube channels. Think about all the Europeans that profited so heavily,
Yeah.
selling artifacts on the black market. Now Egypt has its independence from the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
They want Egypt to be Egyptian, even though, you could argue, like, does the culture of, ancient Egyptian culture, it's a dead culture, right? The civilization is dead. It's not like the Maya. The Maya still exists.
Right.
They still speak the languages. They still worship the same gods. Egypt does not exist anymore. But nonetheless, the Egyptians that live there, even though they may not follow the same culture or religion of the ancient Egyptians, they own the land of Egypt, and they want the control to be in the hands of Egyptians. And in some sense, I can't find any moral qualm with that. As a whole, just on principle, right? Like, they want the vice grip on any new discovery that comes out. Whoa, 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 whoa.
Mm-hmm.
The United States, you're not breaking this news. Poland, you're not breaking this news. France, you're not breaking it.
I get that.
England, you're not breaking this news.
Absolutely.
We are going to, one of the things that, if they discover a big tomb, or if they discover
Mm-hmm.
some void in the pyramid or whatever, the information about it might get leaked. There will be little things that pop up, but the big announcement is going to be 15 months down the road, when the Egyptian government, they have a whole media thing that's going on as well. They've got, like, okay, we're going to televise this. We're going to make documentaries about this. We've got to get Netflix in here now.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to get American exposure. We've got to get English exposure. We've got to get
tell Graham Hancock.
Asian exposure. We got to call Graham Hancock to come in. Like, it's a whole thing, right? It's not like they, oh wow, we just found this tomb. Boom, 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 boom. Let's post it. They are maximizing the profit from that discovery, because they want to keep on making more discoveries, because they want that giant, nice, grand Egyptian museum that they just built.
Sure.
So it's kind of like all of that. You look at the general principle of it. There's nothing wrong with that, my opinion. You look at Zahi Hawass and his behavior, you start getting down to the individual people. I think no matter who it was in a position that powerful, I don't know, it's like a US politician, right? Like, are there really any politicians that you look at as like, oh, that guy's so morally upstanding? I can't think of one.
There are some who do.
Yeah, people do. Yeah, but no, I agree with you. You have to sort of divorce what that means. Like, you're talking about the significance of Egypt, saying, hey, we're going to break the news on this. It would be the same for anywhere else. I respect the hell out of that, because you should. It's your country. You're finding artifacts and learning new things about it, right? There's no reason that the British History Museum should come in and break that news for anybody. Like, I get that. But at the same time, when you consider some of the behavior, it definitely erodes a lot of the trust and integrity there is in doing something like that. But I think there's a lot of different ways and other ways and culture that people can divorce those things, right? Like musicians, I definitely don't agree with a lot of what certain musicians do in their life, but I appreciate their music. And so it's just kind of one of these things, right? Like, I appreciate Egyptology. I appreciate the history and all of that. I don't even have to look at Zawi Hawass, right? I just look at what's there in front of me and the history and the new things, and I can appreciate the fact that we're still learning about this culture, thousands of years after it is gone, like in its ancient form.
Yeah. I totally agree with you, man. I have a newfound respect for, do I say the Ministry of Antiquities? I don't know. I just have a newfound respect for the actual people that live in Egypt. Before I went to Egypt, not surprisingly, they didn't exist to me in my brain. You know what I mean? I was so focused on the ancient Egyptians. It wasn't until I went there that I spent time with the actual Egyptians,
Mm-hmm.
and one of these guys, his name's Ehab. He's an Egyptologist that was traveling with us, and you know, I just realized like my a big part of my living now. I've been able to quit my job in the United States. I've been able to make enough money on YouTube talking largely about ancient Egypt, not entirely, but largely about Egypt. I've been able to make a sufficient amount of USD to quit my job. And I go to Egypt and
It's
meet this
amazing.
guy who has way, he towers my knowledge of Egypt. His specialty is the Amarna period, by the way. Um,
Ah.
and I just saw that he was struggling. He's like
Mm-hmm.
he's a couple years older than me, and he was struggling, and it was just overwhelmingly clear in my mind that like, oh,
Right.
yeah, the Egyptians, they need their time to be able to monetize all of this just like everybody else would.
Mm-hmm.
And
Great
I
point.
guess with that, they're gonna kind of control the narrative. I mean, like they've got their
Mm.
ideas of the things that they want. I don't know if you remember the not really a scandal, but like controversy over Zahi Hawass, him kind of jumping around as to what he thought about the Great Pyramid. Do you remember this a couple years ago?
I do. I don't remember the specifics, but I do remember seeing a lot of this online. I think a couple other people who are in this sphere talked about it on like other podcasts too.
Yeah, so it was really odd. Um, and it kind of showed. I feel like it pulled the veil back or it kind of pulled the veil back of one of two things: either the Ministry of Antiquities, Zahi Hawass, Egyptologists that live in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
their ideas about the Great Pyramid aren't as firmly founded as we all are kind of led to believe or as they present.
Mm-hmm.
Either that or Zahi Hawass himself, his beliefs are not as firmly founded as he presents. But
Mm.
when the Scan Pyramids Project sent that cam up, or when they first detected that there were these two voids in the pyramid, there's one that's adjacent to the Grand Gallery, sitting above it or parallel to it, and then there is another that is sitting above the main entrance to the pyramid. I think it's behind these huge chevrons that are near the entrance.
Mm-hmm.
When there was all the fuss about that, people started questioning Zahi. He strangely said that Khufu's actual burial was in that front smaller chamber that they sent the cam up into, which is right next to the entrance. Like clearly it's a
Mm-hmm.
void that used to be an entrance at one point, and then it was closed in on both sides. And he
Mm-hmm.
oddly said, no, that used to be, or that was intended, or something like that. That was intended to be the burial place. And that alarmed everybody because not even the pyramidiates, like even the craziest, far like out there, pseudo archaeologists, none of them even thought that might have been a burial site. So for him to say it was completely out of left field.
Yeah.
um so yeah, it was an odd like grabbing onto, no, this is actually what it is, and then he let it go and he's never addressed it since then. But
Mm.
it just kind of it gave you that moment where you kind of saw through the veil, and you saw that
Mhm.
maybe these findings aren't always as concrete as they seem, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, I guess that's my long-winded kind of scatterbrained thought on whether or not they're trying to control the narrative. I think they want to control everything, partly rightly so.
Yeah. No,
I
I
can
get that completely.
completely understand it because if Egypt didn't have archaeological tourism, would people be traveling there?
No.
Yep.
And then also if you look at their history, at least modern history, like their culture has been completely pillaged by the British, by the French, like you said, by
Napoleon.
Americans,
Yeah.
everybody trying to rush in there to put their name on some type of great discovery. And I'm completely sympathetic to their position because of that. This is our culture, our country, and we want to maintain that. I'm always just concerned about whether or not I'm getting the truth about something, and it makes me laugh because you see the same thing in all the other fields of academia. I feel like paleontology is rife with it because everybody wants to put their name on a dinosaur. And so there's all of this rush to, it's like, hey, we've got this new find, and then all the speculation goes up and we look at it and it's like, well, maybe this is a brand new species that nobody's seen before, and you got to put your name on it because then you get your name attached to the discovery. And then that inevitably kind of leads to this argument from authority standpoint, right? Where it's like, hey, don't argue with me because I've got the degrees and I've studied this more than you. And you're just, it's like, but isn't science supposed to be about questioning what we understand to be true to continue to keep getting, closer and closer to what the truth is? And that's just why I'm always like, man, I'm that kind of stuff just concerns me, and
Mhm.
I just want to know that we're understanding the actual big picture and it's not something that's being sold. But that's
Yeah.
just my thoughts on it.
And I think that that's kind of, especially now that we kind of have this unified world in a way, like where we're
Mm-hmm.
all tapped into the same media, right? We
Mm-hmm.
all sort of answer to the same entities. Um, and it seems that all the entities that we answer to are all kind of ideologically aligned, right? Um, or that we get our information from. They are all ideologically similar. Um, but I think that what is largely ignored is the human aspect of the people that are in control of the narrative, right? Or the people that control the valve of what comes out, right? Like these are also human beings that are not smarter than you and I, that are no more
That's a great point.
prone to temptation of power or money or anything. I my channel has really nothing to do with conspiracy theories at all,
Right.
but for anybody to for these people that brush off conspiracy theories as if they don't exist, you're an idiot. Like there
Oh yeah.
conspiracy theories have existed since the beginning of time. That is actually more human than people who are in control of things actually having the best interest at heart of the people that they don't even know that are so far below them, right? Uh,
Without a doubt.
so I guess that human aspect, um, they would like us to ignore that and not acknowledge that, but the human aspect of it is always there. I mean, it exists in Mexican archaeology. There's lots of
Mm-hmm.
Mexican archaeology is very tumultuous. People, the directors of sites are constantly coming and going because whether it's like racism, or sexism or whatever it is, it's all there. And all of those things damage and hinder the archaeological process that's going. So, the principles of the whole thing, like the idyllic version of it, when you remove all the human beings is great, but when you put all the human beings in, the complications are impossible to avoid, and then also you shouldn't ignore them. Um,
I think we're
so
just talking about human nature, really, right? You
yeah,
can't get away. You can't get away from these things. There, like you said, there's conspiracy theories that are all throughout history. And you could think of 100 different ones, and those add to the to keep using the word narrative, but it adds to the narrative just as much as the hard evidence, right? And it's part. I think it's part of the intrigue of learning about history, and especially ancient history, where you do have to fill in the gaps, right? And that's where conspiracy comes from. When you don't have all the information, human beings just tend to fill in the gaps and make their own assumptions about things. But I am really interested to hear about just what you saw, and I want to hear, like, obviously, like, when you think about this, you talk about, like, man, they moved all this massive stones and these statues and all this stuff, and we're still learning about the pyramids, like you said, like these voids that are inside of them. Like, when you were there, like, I want to hear about these things and learn more about them, because now too, everybody's got like a YouTube channel. There's all these people, like Jimmy Corsetti, I know, was just on like Joe Rogan talking about some of this stuff. And we've talked about Jimmy Corsetti before on some of the other podcasts we've done, but like discussing how it almost seems like we're learning new things, which is crazy to think about, that you're learning new things about something that is so much part of like the zeitgeist of history that everybody knows. But I'm interested to hear like what you saw, how that is sort of like the history, I guess, and the way we view the history is changing. And then like just talking about the awesomeness that it is that these people were able to accomplish these things.
Yeah. So I think, the huge stones have been a topic of discussion for a long, long time. Herodotus was actually writing about them in 450 BC. He visits Egypt. He writes about this. He goes to the city of Sais, Egypt, and this local Egyptian guy takes him to this temple, and there's a stone by which, if you calculate the measurements, it is 6,000 tons. Completely insane. I mean, I think the stone of the pregnant woman at Baalbek is like 1,400 tons. So
Yeah.
maybe, almost surely, there's some kind of weird thing happening in the numbers there, but it was a huge stone, whatever he was taken to see. And it just either doesn't exist anymore, or, it's covered up by the sands of time in the last 2,400 years. So the thing that I was most amazed by when it comes to stonework was the amount of absolutely stunning statues that are in Egypt. And how much that actually reinforced my idea of, okay, all of this is, it's not really so much an argument or a debate of timeline as much as it is technology and techniques. Because, these concepts used to be, there was this lost civilization that built the pyramids that made all these huge megalithic stones. However, these stones, this specific lost civilization, they didn't use hieroglyphs. They didn't have art. All of these things are functional, right? And there was a clear-cut difference between that and dynastic Egypt. And then at some point, that idea jumped into, also these statues that are made with the same kind of stone that have this just unbelievable polish on them, that are, sometimes up to 1,000 ton, like the Colossus of the Ramesseum, 1,000-ton single piece statue brought from 300 miles away at Aswan.
Wow.
Mind-boggling stuff. But something clicked in my mind when that jump was made in this, popular narrative. I was like, well, originally I thought that all of these huge blank stones, these with no art, it makes sense. Okay, that's a clear separation from dynastic Egypt, where you see the pharaohs with the Nemes headdress and, these deeply cut, incised hieroglyphs. But then all of a sudden it jumped into, actually these statues, the hard stone ones, are also from the lost civilization. And the Egyptians later on found them and appropriated them and kind of reinvented this culture.
Yeah.
And in traveling so much throughout Egypt and seeing just how many of these hard stone statues there are with this incredible polish. There's even one, King Tut. You're familiar with King Tut? The little boy king who he's nothing in his lifetime, and he's probably assassinated, but he becomes the most famous pharaoh of all time because his tomb is found intact. There are hard, dark gray granite statues made of him that are life-size to him, and it's a kind of polish that's like otherworldly. I'll send you guys these photos to put them in. Just stunning. Like the statue work was amazing. Like almost mirror quality. If you shine a light up to them, I've got some photos of this as well. If you shine a light up to some of these statues and you put your finger near that light and you look at it from the side, you'll see a perfect reflection of your finger in the forehead of a pharaoh.
Thousands of years after they've been
made.
And
this is 3,000 years of, that's insane.
Well, so what's interesting is there's a flip at some point. So you have, in the Old Kingdom, you have all these giant megalithic stones. Let's say, the vast majority of the stones of the Great Pyramid are 1 to 2 tons. Huge still. I mean, freaking huge. Like, you only fit 2 of them in this room,
Right.
And and there's 2.5 million of them that make up the pyramid. Not all of them are the same size. Some of them are smaller. In the king's chamber, the lintels that sit up in the ceiling that, have to go from one block to the other and across the entire ceiling, those are from 50 to 80 tons a piece that are lifted 150 feet up off the ground, brought from 500 miles away at Aswan. So all of these things are happening at the beginning of time. There are people that are disappointed if I tell them they're not 12,000 years old and they're only 5,000. I'm like, man,
for real.
Okay, there's nothing else going on at 4600 BC. There's nothing else happening. Every other culture, I'm being exaggerative here, but every other culture is still playing in the dirt. Okay, the Egyptians are building the biggest monument that the world has ever seen, while every other culture around them is playing in the dirt. It may as well be 12,000 years ago. Sorry,
is this because I was just, to your point, like they're the only ones doing this. Is this because they are so well off they can afford the time to do this? Is that the consensus? Yeah.
Yes. So the Nile is so fertile that one farmer, I've seen it proposed, and this is a huge variation here, but it gives you this idea. One farmer could produce enough wheat and barley grain to feed 100 to 1,000 men. So you have this huge population that doesn't have to farm. One guy can handle 100 to 1,000 people. So what do you do with this whole gigantic population that you've got, because you have so much food and you have so many calories?
Smoke Lotus and have sex parties, baby.
Smoke Lotus, have sex parties. But see, that's all at night. These people got to have something to do during the day, because if they don't, you have a bunch of dudes around that need to burn off testosterone. Well, they're gonna go raid and pillage local communities and bully beer breweries. That was a thing that happened in Egypt. There's a guy who writes to the pharaoh, and he's like, or he writes to the pharaoh, or he writes to like a local governor or something. He says, these kids keep coming over and harassing my brewery and breaking into it. I need protection. Those kids needed something to do. Wild. They needed a temple to go build, or they needed to be sent off to Nubia to go fight or something like that. So you have this whole population of people that need something to do. And the pharaoh, if you're in charge, you got to be in charge. You got to tell people what to do,
Yeah.
So, there's no currency like money that we have today. You've got taxes and you've got resources. And so one of the ways that the system that they set up is, one of the ways that you could pay your taxes to the pharaoh is by seasonal labor. And then you do other things with your time. So, theoretically, 4 months out of the year, you are a laborer helping build whatever temple it is that the pharaoh wants to build right now. And the temple's probably propped up. It becomes this whole like cyclical thing that the temples are propped up because there's this huge labor force, these people that need something to do. They're all looking to the pharaoh to get, to tell them what to do and to give them sustenance, to give them food, to give them payment. So the pharaoh says, okay, you build this temple for me, and these farmers, you now owe me this amount of tax, and I use this tax to pay these guys who built this temple for me. And it's this cycle, right? It just goes around and around and around and around. And the pharaoh is juggling all of it, he's trying to keep everyone happy, keep them busy, don't keep them looking at him. He's got to stay, in charge. This is like super simple, like breakdown of it. But that's kind of what's going on. And then you do that for 4 months, and then you need something else to do for another 4 months. So you become a soldier. So you're a soldier, and you've got to go up to, you've got to go down to Nubia and beat up on the Nubians and sack all the Nubian towns and take all of their gold and bring it back home. And you've been on an expedition for 4 months, just basically subjugating everyone around Egypt and reminding them, like, you guys are nothing compared to us. Give us all your nice stuff. We're going home. The Egyptians did that every year. They checked in on everybody and beat the crap out of them and took all their nice stuff and their women.
Read boat raiders.
Exactly.
You got to show them who's boss.
And then so for the next 4 months, theoretically, you're free to do what you want to do. You go work on the farm, you work on, whatever. Or maybe
it's not a bad life.
Maybe somehow you kick back. Now that's just kind of like a very simplified hypothetical view as to what may have been going on in Egypt. But that's how these old kingdom structures are being built. But you must have highly educated people that are overseeing these huge projects, because you can't have a bunch of uneducated slaves. They're not slaves, but a bunch of uneducated poor workers being able to so finely cut and polish these stones and know the physics and the mechanics by which you quarry them, move them onto a barge. Just the act of moving it onto the barge without sinking it is mind blowing. I mean, there could be a whole profession in ancient Egypt just in that. The perfection of doing that. Imagine, I always try to think about, like, okay, just that, loading on these huge stones to these barges that could easily be toppled, I'm sure. Imagine the years that it took trial and error to be able to do something like that.
Great point.
People, have you guys ever seen Wally Wallington before? The guy who's able to move these 1,000-ton stones like on one single point. Have you ever seen this? He can.
Oh yeah, it's like in his backyard. Is that who you're talking about?
Yeah.
I've seen that guy. Yes.
So if you bring him up, people will go, well, Wally Wallington is only moving things on a flat plane. Him doing this doesn't explain how the Egyptians were able to put an 80-ton stone 150 feet up in the air in the ceiling of the king's chamber. Okay, well, give me 500 Wally Wallingtons over the course of 600 years. I bet you they can figure it out. I bet
or
you
500. What's his name? Edward Lead Scalnons. Whoever built that Coral Castle down in Florida, because he was able to figure it out too.
Yeah. So you have these geniuses that what I think about what we do in our daily life. Like, we, compared to our knowledge of the natural world, we are stupid compared to these people. My entire day I spend studying history that is not relevant to my own life. I am.
Me too.
I could survive better in ancient Egypt than I could survive in ancient Egypt or Rome or Greece or something than I survive like in this world. I probably know more about that culture than I do anything about, American culture. If I really had to get into the weeds on it. I'm being a little exaggerative, but when I'm not doing that, I might be watching a show on Netflix with my wife, or reading a book about, Henry V, or playing Kingdom Come Deliverance that just came out, doing something like that. These guys lived in their world. They are trying to figure out the best way to extrapolate the most out of the natural world with which they live in. And they're doing a hell of a lot of thinking. I try to imagine, like, I'm sure you guys raked leaves when you were younger.
Yes.
You have to rake leaves. The worst when you're younger raking leaves is when you've lost your headphones and you can't just like tune out into music or listen to a YouTube video or a podcast or something, and you just have to sit there and rake and think all day long. That's the life that those people lived, thinking. These were really freaking smart people, really clever people, I should say. So that's kind of how these huge megalithic stones in the Old Kingdom are erected. Well, when the Old Kingdom collapses, again, people are looking for this lost civilization. If you're looking for that lost civilization, look at the Old Kingdom. That's it. That is actually the lost civilization you're looking for, and then dive into that. All the answers you're looking for might be somewhere in there. You might be the person to figure it out. The Old Kingdom collapses because of like catastrophic drought and a pharaoh that reigned for too long. Weekend at Bernie's Joe Biden
Yeah.
style.
I knew you were gonna say it.
Yeah.
In
Sure.
in office for way too long, and when the chief isn't the chief, and it's not this young, spry, strong, maverick leader, ancient Egypt only does well when it's ruled entirely by the pharaoh. Egypt is not meant to be ruled by the whole pharaoh's council and all these other people that aren't actually directly blood related to the pharaoh. It's meant to be ruled by a 35, 40-year-old man that is in complete control of Egypt.
Henry II Plantagenet, but in Egypt.
Exactly, right. That is what Egypt needs. Not this 95-year-old dude that should have put his son up as the co-regent 50 years ago and never did that for some reason. Pepi II.
Okay, that's a real person.
Yeah. So he's the last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom. So Egypt collapses. This age of the pyramids is over. This grand era of Egyptian civilization is no more. And for the rest of Egyptian history, people will write down on these little papyri notes, "Oh, how I long for the golden days of Senefru."
How about that?
The Senefru he's a notorious pyramid builder in the Old Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
So the Middle Kingdom comes back a couple hundred years later. They try to build pyramids again, but a lot of them are mud bricks. Some of them are modestly sized stones, but they crumble and fall apart. And the technology, the know-how, the skill, the craft, the stone masonry, it's all gone. They have some amazing statuary work though, but it gets better in the New Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom falls apart. The New Kingdom rises again under almost the first, I think. And in the New Kingdom, we don't see megalithic stones anymore.
Okay.
Not really, not to the quantity that we saw them in the Old Kingdom, but we see 1,000-ton, incredibly polished, solid Aswan granite statues being erected all over the place. Not all 1,000 tons, but some of them hundreds of tons. We also now we're getting really, really big obelisks, like 300-ton obelisks being erected and lifted. There's a great Egyptologist out there that I look up to. His name's Bob Breyer, and his hot take, and maybe he's being facetious in a way, but he says that erecting an obelisk, this 300 to 600 ton tower, is would have been more difficult than building a pyramid. And I have a close friend who's he'll probably be watching this. His name's John. He and I we spent a week talking about obelisks, and he told me something along the lines, I might be butchering it, but when you're raising that obelisk up, when you get to the point beyond 15 degrees, or beyond 26 degrees, maybe that's what it is, every further degree you go, you need 15% more force to raise up that obelisk.
Okay.
I mean, you're talking about genius on a whole other level to be able to do this. Right. And they erected a lot of obelisks. And I think that it was that switch was one of the things that I noticed, that, okay, in the Old Kingdom, you have these gigantic stones. It dies. The Egyptians lose the technology, but they gain a new technology. These finely polished, gigantic statues that are, have you seen the ones where it's the flower of life, sacred geometry put over the faces of the pharaohs, and they're perfectly symmetrical on each side? They're not perfect, but they're really, 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 really close.
No, that's insane.
Perfect. And still insane, even if it's like 95% perfect. Right. It's insane.
Yeah.
And so I think that it was seeing these massive statues with a type of polish that can't really be appreciated unless you're looking at it in person, because you can see, what are we looking at, like 120 frames per second as you're looking at something, and you're going back and forth, and you're looking at the polish of this hard granite. And when you spend so much time around other, like when you go see the unfinished obelisk and you rub your hand on it, man, you can cut yourself on granite easy. If you just press down your hand, it's rough. It's very hard.
Yeah.
To get something like that in the Stone Age, or in the Bronze Age, I'm sorry,
Mm-hmm.
down to down to such a fine polish that's like more well polished than the table I'm rubbing my hand on right now. Like I'm rubbing my hand on a polished wooden table, but this is solid granite that's much more finely polished, that's much more reflective than this. You know, the explanation behind how they were able to do this, I feel like just hasn't properly been explained. And really, that's just because it's such a miraculous feat that, of course, it's mind blowing to us, 3,500 years later. So yeah, I think that was one of the things that was most profound to me was the statuary work and just how amazing it is. I'll have to send you guys a bunch of photos
I would love that.
Yeah.
No, it is amazing to me when you think about these things and just what they were able to accomplish, because I think there's a mistake in thinking that a lot of people have when you look back on people throughout history, and just there's almost this like looking down your nose at them, because it's like, oh, well, this is right now is the pinnacle of human civilization. But to your point about the way they lived and the way they were able to do some of these things, I think it's really easy to sort of get lost in this idea that they had like some crazy technology. But it's to me, it's like when you're in that life, you're living it that way, you have a perspective that none of us have, right? And why do we do things? We do things out of necessity. We do things out of practicality, all these things, right? And you'd like to think when you live in this time, like you have to do things that are practical, because the amount of leisure time you have isn't what, you were talking about before. You can go read a book, you can go watch Netflix. Like you have to be very deliberate, I feel like, in what you're doing. And so when you have that necessity and you have to have, and you just have that perspective, because it is just your perspective, you wouldn't think anything of it because it's just the way you think. You come up with these ways to do these things, like polish the granite, like move these stones, using a fulcrum to lift stones off the ground with all these people. And it just becomes apparent to you, because I think also that you're more attached to, like, mentally in tune with your environment and what's going on around you, because when you're working in the barley fields and you're supplying the barley to the brew house, right? All you're doing from harvesting to walking it there to dropping it off and walking back is thinking, and you're interacting with your environment in a way that you and I just cannot do and don't understand. It's like I don't know if you've ever, like, I've seen people like in training before, like you're out and you're away from like your creature comforts, and people struggle for the first couple of days pretty hardcore, but eventually you just sort of like get in that groove of being in that environment, and like you start to see, like, man, there's that primitive caveman that's still in there way in the back of our brain, right? And some of that thought process I think still exists, but when you're there, like that's it, like it's second nature. It is your life. It's not something crazy. I mean, it's crazy to think, and it's amazing, but like, it's not unconventional, because it's just the way you're living your life, the way we wouldn't think anything of going and getting in your car and driving to work.
Yeah. Another thing you said about about trying to get in these people's heads. As an anthropologist, that's what I love doing. Trying to come up with, like, why are they doing this? And I think that's the big problem with the popular space right now, is that they love obsessing over these amazing feats, like these amazing statues. They love obsessing over the measurements and why they're so symmetrical and why they're so perfect.
Mm-hmm.
You bring up the fact that the dynastic Egyptians may have done it. They don't really want to hear that. They think that it must have been some other lost civilization. The problem there is you just don't know what you don't know, and you don't realize that if you were to dive in and try to figure out the Egyptian mindset, things might start making sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
Really simple example here is, Brandon and Chris, you guys are people. I'm the Pharaoh, and I say that you guys are going to become master stonemasons. I have all the resources and the money in the world. I really want this statue, by the way. Also, I'm God on earth. I am God. I'm not king. I'm God. So
it shall be done.
I'm going to get this statue. As a good ruler, though, you're going to be handsome rewardedly, and I'm not going to put a time limit on when I want this, by the way. You're going to show up here every day to this place that I've provided for you. I'll give you the tools that you need. This statue is going to be a permanent marker of my existence. I want it perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you as much time as you want. I'll pay you every single day that you show up here, and you have no time limit. You know why? Because I'm so rich. I have nothing else to do with this, with all of this grain and all of this income and all of this gold. And I really want this statue. So you got all the time in the world. Go ahead and get started. That thing will be perfect. It's going to, you know what I mean? It's going to end up being what I wanted it to be anyways. And that's the reality of the Pharaoh living in Egypt. You know,
right.
He had all the resources in the world to get what he wanted. There's no
the supreme ruler.
It doesn't have to be practical. It's not a usage thing. He's God on earth. That's what he wants. And he has the resources to make sure that the people making this for him can do that, you know?
Yeah.
And there's no time limit. Like if I had 5 years with the primitive methods to make one of these Egyptian statues, I could do it starting right now. You give me 5 years. I got nothing else to do. I'll make the best pharaonic statue that's ever been made. You know, I'm sure that must have been the reality for so many of these stonemasons. It was obviously incredibly important to the Pharaoh, and he knew it was going to last forever. It's still there today, you know? So just things like that, you know? I'm sure that these guys who, you know, think about with some of our hobbies, like when you really get into something and you're kind of a freak about it, like you're a perfectionist about it. It's just it's this irrational obsession, right? Okay, imagine being God on earth and you can have whatever you want. Imagine how much irrational obsession and, you know, desire for perfection you would have, especially when you have the resources to get exactly what you want and there's nothing stopping you. There's nothing stopping you. You have everything. You're God on earth, you know. That's
with some pretty big Legos.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, it's just and again, all of that is a gift from the Nile. Yeah. Also, to leave you with a teaser, we were talking about the lotus, the lotus flower. The lotus flower intrinsically represents ancient Egypt, and the Egyptians acknowledge this too. In so many ways, it's symbolic of ancient Egypt. That and the papyrus flower. But the lotus flower does something really interesting. Put yourself in, okay, so let's say pyramids, 2700 BC. Things start getting rocking there. But you go back to you go back to 4000 BC. You know, you already have these villages and chieftains and people living and being active in Egypt. So let's put ourselves there. This primordial soup, this place really, 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 really far back in time. You're spending every day going up to the Nile, and you notice that there's this bright blue, gorgeous flower that emerges out of the Nile every day. And by the time the sun hits its zenith in the sky or hits noon, the flower blooms to worship the sun. Every single day it comes out of the Nile. And then as the sun sets, the flower closes and it sinks back below into the underworld. And every day it rises to worship the sun. Every day. Imagine the imprint that has on the Egyptian psychology. Whoa, this flower.
Some serious allegory.
Yeah, this flower is rising to worship the sun every day. You know, the sun is already important. It gives you everything that you need. You know, it's why the sun cultures, you know, these sun worshiping cultures around the world, you know, actually, you know, it's why all of the Americas were sun worshiping cults and you know.
Yeah.
Anyways, so you have the lotus flower that's probably one of the very first things that is intimately tied to the psychology of the ancient Egyptians. Imagine that far back in time. Imagine what starts their psychology. It's the sun, gives life to everything, and you have this beautiful flower that emerges out of this, kind of gross, dirty freshwater river, right?
Mm-hmm.
Out of that muddy darkness emerges this beautiful flower that connects itself to the sun. This flower is acknowledging the sun, driving this point home. But that's thousands, of years before Egypt really kicks off. And it's why the Egyptians, chose that flower to represent themselves. Well, the Egyptians probably did not have any kind of aerial flying spacecraft to realize this, but the land of Egypt itself, look at it from satellite imagery, is a flower. You have the Nile that goes up and it blooms in
And the delta.
It is,
Yeah.
the entire land is a flower. What kind of cosmic,
Symbolism.
symbolism is that?
Yeah.
I say that, and there are, Egyptologists who roll their eyes at that, but that's not something I roll my eyes at.
Nah,
Like,
I can't discredit that.
if the Egyptians had known, it would have instantly made sense to them. Of
Yeah.
course it's a flower. And so that kind of leads into my whole, this flower that seduced Egypt, the importance of this lotus flower. I think that it has an incredible importance that's not fully understood today, and I think it might have something to do with these pre-dynastic vases that everybody is so obsessed with.
Dude, I think that you are 100% onto something. And like, it's been a while since something has like really sparked a deep interest and intrigue. Like, I want to track your work, what you put out with this. And you absolutely sound like you're onto something. We are coming, I mean, we're past the 90 minutes we talked about. And I want to keep my integrity on it. And, thank you for doing this and then coming back on the show again for a third time. If I could ask you one last question, one little last anecdote you have from your time there to leave us with, other than that amazing tidbit about the Lotus to close us out, and we can close up shop here.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was the last question?
No, just if you could leave us with one last little anecdote, something that really stuck with you about your time there in Egypt to close us out, I would appreciate it.
Oh man.
It's probably so many. What a loaded question.
A Lotus question? Is that what you said?
A Lotus question. That's it. Yeah, exactly.
Man, if I had one thing that I would close us out with, something that I think is important for people to think about. I think it's something that people who are listening to this will probably already identify with. But these are people whose lives were just as significant as us. They had heartache, heartbreak. They loved. A lot of them suffered. And, we don't really think about it nowadays because, we use their existence to enrich our own lives and fill our minds with fascination. But the people that are interested in ancient Egypt, are the only people alive that are looking out for their lives. Without us, those people will disappear like they never existed, right? We all kind of have a responsibility to just, if you have a fascination with, some part of history, you should look into it. You should learn more about it, and you should tell other people about it, because one, it informs us of where we come from, even as far back as ancient Egypt. Like when people say that this common phrase that, like, when somebody dies, you say they've gone west. That comes from the Egyptians. The sun dies every day in the west. It goes back into the underworld. That's why the Egyptians buried themselves on the west side of the Nile.
It's profound.
You look at ancient Egypt, and even then there's things that are relevant to our lives today. And you can look at things that happened historically. I'll just say this, not to get like overtly political, but every time that Egypt's civilization crashed, the reason for it was because it was so prosperous that so many people moved to ancient Egypt that it disrupted the cultural identity of Egypt, and it
How about
crumbled
that?
like that every time, and especially the Old Kingdom.
And you can see that in other civilizations too, not just like today, but like happened to Rome too, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's
Citizenship has to mean something.
One of the things that it taught me was that, that trying to, if you have a civilization that's doing well, and I learned this most abundantly by studying, the collapse of the Old Kingdom, a civilization that's doing well, it is not inherently wrong for that civilization to just want to keep going the way it is, and not have anything disrupt it. Because when something disrupts it, there's no going back. There's no fixing it. It's gonna collapse. And I mean, maybe that's just the fate of the world. But yeah. I think that even studying ancient history as far back as 4,000, 5,000 years ago can still be relevant to our lives today and inform the things that we see going on around us. We don't have to go through our lives blind. There's nothing new under the sun. Human beings are exactly the same, they behave exactly the same way they always have. And that the second thing is that, without historians, without just normal people, I mean, really normal, like if there weren't normal people interested in ancient Egypt, there wouldn't be anybody being paid, or I'm sorry, interested in history. There wouldn't be anybody being paid to be a historian. And so just knowing that, like, we are actually the only people that look out for those people and their lives. Like, look at your hand, think about how significant and physical your life really is, and how much you love the things that you love in your life and how much you'd hate to lose them. They had all the same aspects of their lives. So anyways, I think that's what I would leave people with, kind of like some philosophy of why history is important.
No, I love that. And I actually would tie it really fast to something that you said earlier in the podcast. You were talking about Pepe, I think, right? The 90-year pharaoh, or whatever. Was that his name, Pepe?
Yeah.
And you think about, somebody asked in your live chat, they said, I wonder why that culture collapsed. And when you look at history, and you do, you see how history goes in cycles, right? And as societies collapse, they like collectively condense, and they become, more totalitarian. And there's evidence of that if you're holding on to power for 90 years and you're the last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, right? To me, it's like indicative of that cycle, right? Where civilizations go through these periods. Like you had the Roman Republic, and then you have the Roman Empire, and like gradually, all of that wealth, and the people wanting to be a part of that eventually will turn into somebody taking power and saying, we're going to go and revisit the old ways. We're going to do this to centralize power and control these things. And these sorts of things happen before collapse. And it's so interesting to see that depicted in your story earlier. Like, to me, like, why did it collapse? I don't know. But like, you think about the evidence of the fact that somebody was holding on to power for 90 years, and that it basically led to them being the last pharaoh there of the Old Kingdom, is just, to me, paints that picture perfectly of how these cycles happen. And like you said, civilizations will always go that way. And the Egyptians were really lucky that they had, like you said, that Middle Kingdom part, but they lived in such a resource rich area that they were able to rebuild again. And not everybody has that opportunity. And because there are civilizations that, reached their zenith, had their collapse, and just were gone, and the Egyptians had a luxury, a gift, like you said, like Herodotus said, they were given a great gift. But man, I appreciate you coming on and talking to us, dude. These conversations are always great. The last couple we had were awesome. I said it before and I'll say it again. Your story about your grandfather, like, there's definitely, you're marked absolutely by fate. I think this is more than just an interest for you. There's like a destiny aspect to it. And I've said that to you before. I mean it. I don't just not being hyperbolic or blowing smoke up your ass, but it's always cool to listen to people that have a passion for what they do. And then somebody I think who has it, is taking it a little bit further because somebody's shining on you for some of these things that you're getting the opportunity to go and do. And I think that's fantastic. And to everybody listening, probably some people that are discovering us for the first time, I appreciate you guys listening to us. Thank you for your time. And Luke, it's always outstanding to talk to you, my man.
Yeah, everybody watching, go subscribe to the I Came with Fire podcast. I've got it linked like 5 times in the title and in the description. Guys, man, I had a great time speaking to you two as well. And awesome. Next time we got to do some Amarna period, because I want to. Another part of the Old Kingdom collapse was, the entire government of Egypt needs to be ruled by the pharaoh and his family. But over time, like, my second cousin dies. Oh, I got to replace him with my buddy Johnny. More people die. I got to replace him with these guys that I know less. Over time, the government starts to grow around the pharaoh and it starts to compete with him. Then by Pepi II, well, the pharaoh is really he might just be a puppet now. So now everyone's just propping him up, and all these other people are running, the Egyptian government. They're not, their borders aren't strong. People are coming in. They're also facing drought. It's just all these things hit at once. And when you don't have the maverick who's actually at the front, who has full authority over ancient Egypt, you can't do anything. You're at a gridlock, right? You have too much going on. Well, something really interesting. Amenhotep III, his son, Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep III is competing for power against the priests of Thebes, or the priests that are working in Karnak. And while his reign is really prosperous and really successful, he's probably raising his son. They're walking around the palace, and he's up in Memphis. The priests are all down in the south at Thebes, and he's probably pacing around the palace telling him, this isn't the way that Egypt should be ruled. I should not have to answer to these priests at all. Listen, Amenhotep IV, when you're pharaoh, you should change this. Things don't, how your dad is when you talk to your dad. Like, you hear your dad pissed off all the time. Well, when Amenhotep the fourth becomes the pharaoh, he actually follows through with that, and he goes, I'm shutting down all of the temples. I'm not even going to be Amenhotep the fourth anymore. I'm going to be Akhenaten, and I'm going to move the capital, the religious capital, away from Thebes, and I'm going to make a new city, and I am going to be the sole political, economic, military, and religious ruler of ancient Egypt, and all these priests can go to hell. And that's the beginning. That's the beginning.
Didn't he force a monotheistic religion on Egypt as well?
Yeah. That's basically what he's doing, right? So there's this idea that he's this heretical pharaoh that, and I'm not co-signing one side or the other. I'm just like kind of telling the story, but there's this idea that he's this heretical, insane pharaoh that makes all of ancient Egypt about him and shuts down all the temples and claims that he's God or whatever. And that he's just maniac. But there's this other idea that he's trying to look back on the pharaohs of the pyramid builders who saw themselves as one with the sun god Ra, right? So he adopts the Aten, which is the sun disk, which is also, another sun god. And he says, I am one with this god. And I'm not only the military ruler and the political ruler, I am also the religious ruler, just like the kings of old were. And so he shuts down all the temples, and he essentially just, eliminates all of the people that were giving his dad such a hard time during his dad's reign. That might be what's happening there. So I think that would be something interesting
I would love to do that.
And how the Egyptian priests are very upset.
Even the art is different in the Amarna period. Like, everything is changed. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So there's so much to go into.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's do that. Everybody, thank you again so much for listening to us. I appreciate your time. Check out our sponsors in the show links. That would be awesome. I always say the best way to support us is to support them as well. And Luke, thank you again so much, man.
Thank you, guys. We'll talk again soon.
Cool.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, should be ending at some